Okay, so it connected pretty quick. So maybe whatever the issue was has been fixed. So, all right. Okay, so none of you that were trying to watch the old stream know that there's a new stream, but maybe if you notice that we're up and going again, maybe you can join me here. We'll kind of hang out for a few minutes, try to send out some text messages, let people know that we have started a new stream. So apologize for the glitchiness here. Adam and I decided we jinxed ourselves by being overly confident and excited about being back at Nutri and Macomb because we've never had an internet issue here at this facility. So first time for everything. If you're still trying to watch the old stream has been ended. So you should be able to click on the new live stream that we've just restarted here. I'm not going to go back through everything we talked about in the first one. If you have questions relative to things we were talking about in the first one, if you couldn't understand us because we were glitching too much, please re-ask your questions. Adam gave me the thumbs up that this stream is looking reasonably better.
Clear as a bell.
Same fat agronomist, but at least we've got a good connection. So we're going to go ahead and dive into some of the other content that we wanted to talk about. And one thing that Adam mentioned the other day, that he was in the field with some growers taking some stand counts, and he thought it would be good to just revisit, what we consider to be the best way to take a stand count. And we'll start with corn. Soybeans are a little bit different. But in corn, I like to use what I call the measuring wheel method. So I know that, 16 of my feet is about 1,000th of an acre. So you can, make a mark in the dirt and then step off, 16 of my shoes. And that gets you real close to that 17 feet, 5 inches roughly, that is 1,000th of an acre in 30-inch rows. The problem with that is, even if you count both rows on either side of that, you're only counting about 60 plants typically, and you're counting in a very small area. That's an okay way to do it as long as you do that 6 or 8 times, around an area in the field and kind of average all that together. But especially in a field that has struggled, if it's a good stand, that's going to be perfectly fine. I mean, it is a good, quick way to get a rough idea how good is this stand. So if you do that and you get 35,000 plants, and you do it again and you get 35,000 plants, and you kind of survey that field and you don't see areas that look like they're lighter than where you're counting 35,000 plants, well, yeah, maybe the population's 34, maybe the population's 36. It's probably not 35, but it's good. But if you do that first one and it comes back at 26, and you're like, that's not what I'm looking for. A better way to do it is to use a measuring wheel. And the thing I like about the measuring wheel is you take that wheel, you zero it, and you start walking. And you start counting plants. And you can go as far as you want to go. I would say count at least 200 plants. And you're going to go who knows how far to count 200 plants. And you might go 100 feet to count 200 plants. And if you do, that's 34,849 plants per acre. You might go 125 feet to count 200 plants. And if you do, that's 27,894 plants per acre. You might, unfortunately, have to go 150 feet to count 200 plants. And if you do, that's 23,229 plants per acre. So let's talk a little math about how you get to those numbers. So the first thing you need to know is how many plants you counted. And I'm counting 200 every time. You can count 150 every time. You can count 250 every time. You can count 300 every time. I'd say do a minimum of 100. I like 200. 150 is okay. You just need to know how many you counted. We'll get to that here in a minute. You also need to know how many square feet there are in an acre, which is what? You probably all learned that a long time ago, 43,560. If you can't remember, ask Google, write it on a scrap of paper. Remember 43,560. That number is ingrained in my head more than my social security number is ingrained in my head. And then the other thing you need to know is what's your row spacing? Is it 30 inch? Is it 20 inch? Is it 36? Is it 15? Is it something funky like 22? You just need to know, and you need to know how many feet that is. So obviously 30 inches is 2.5 feet. 20 inches gets a little trickier. That's 1 2/3 feet. So 1.67 feet is a 20-inch row. And then what you do is you make this little decimal number. You divide the area that you count. So when you go 150 feet in a 30-inch row, you just sampled an area of field that is 150 feet times 2.5 feet. So you just sampled 375 square feet. So that 375 square feet is what decimal point of an acre? So 375 divided by 43,560 is 0.0086 acres. And so if you counted 200 plants in 0.0086 acres, that's 23,255 plants per acre. So to use this method, you need to understand math and you need to understand area. You really don't have to memorize any formulas. Now, there are formulas out there that you can, if you always go the same number of plants and you're always in the same row spacing, you can get a formula that will make this a little bit easier for you, but you got to have the formula with you and you got to remember the formula. If you understand the math behind it, you don't really need to remember anything because you can just very quickly do it on the fly. That's the way I like to take stand counts. Now you can do it, measuring with your shoe. You can do it measuring with a tape measure. But if you're measuring with your shoe, you're measuring with a tape measure, you're only going to measure the 17 feet, 5 inches. And that's fine if you got a good field of corn. If you've got a marginal field of corn, you got skips and gaps and bad spots and good spots, I really like that measuring wheel method better. But however you're going to take your stand counts, that's going to give you a number. And then it's going to be up to you, your agronomist, your FSR, your dealer, and your Lord, what number is adequate for you. So we are still in the 100% yield window, which makes me a more aggressive replanter than I would be if it was early June instead of early May. But a lot of you've got a lot of acres that you haven't planted the first time yet. So another rule of thumb of mine is we don't talk replant until we've planted everything the first time first. There are exceptions to that rule. So let's say you've got something you think needs replanted and it's the only field you've got that's fit. Well, okay, maybe we prioritize replanting that field before we get another field planted the first time. And sometimes that happens because you plant your well-drained fields first. And if you haven't planted your poorly drained fields yet, your well-drained fields might be fit to replant before your poorly drained fields are fit to plant the first time. And that's a reality that sometimes happens. So soybeans, real quick, I do like to use a tape measure. Unless you're in drilled beans or something narrower, like 10-inch rows or narrower, the hula hoop method works really good. A quick cheater method on the hula hoop method, if you take a piece of wire, or you can actually take a real hula hoop and take it apart where it's stapled together, cut out a section of it, and then put it back together. If you make that diameter of that hoop 28 point, I think it's about 28 1/4. I'd have to double check the math on that, but somewhere around 28 1/4 inch diameter hoop, you could take a piece of number 9 wire and make it be, a standard hoop is about 36 inches. But if you make your hoop 28.25 inches, that is exactly 1/10,000th of an acre. So if you've got 1/10,000th of an acre within your hoop, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 beans in that hoop, that's 50,000. If you've got 6, 7, 8 beans in that hoop, it's 80,000. If you've got 9, 10, 11 beans in that hoop, that's 110,000. And if you got more than that in that hoop, you planted your beans too thick. But I digress. So the reason this won't work in a 15-inch row very well is because, if you lay it just right, you might get parts of 3 rows in that hoop. You're usually going to get 2, but you're not really sampling things very well. So if you're in 15-inch rows, I'd take a tape measure and I'd lay out like 5 feet of tape. Not going to go 200 feet in beans because we'll be there counting all day long, but lay out 5 feet, count how many plants you've got in 5 feet, divide by 5, figure out plants per foot of row, and then you can very easily calculate what's your population based on plants per foot of row. You can always remember that 140,000 in 30-inch rows is 8 plants per foot. So 4 plants per foot in a 15-inch row is 140,000. 2 plants per foot in a 15-inch row, while it looks like shit, is 70,000, and that's generally enough. Now, most of you will not leave anything much below 100,000 alone. So here's my rule of thumb with replanting soybeans. If it's over 100, we may have a fight in the field if you want to replant that, because I'm going to work really hard to keep you from replanting 100,000. I'm very comfortable with you walking away from 75 or 80,000. You may not be, but that's plenty. You get below 60, that's where we start to lose weed control and we start to maybe lose a little bit of yield. So, soybeans are extremely forgiving. The better your soil, the earlier you planted your beans, the more forgiving they are. If you've got mid-April planted soybeans on good, productive, high fertility soil, 60,000 is probably plenty. If you've got 60,000 on a light timber soil planted June 1st, we probably want to thicken that up. So I don't mind thickening up a stand of soybeans. I hate it when people try to thicken up thin stands of corn. Don't do that. Just, if you've got a half a stand of corn, you either tear it out and start over again, or spray it out and start over again, or leave it the hell alone. 15,000 left alone will yield better than 15,000 with another 20,000 dropped into it. The only thing you're doing when you drop 20,000 into 15 is you're damaging the good 15,000 plants that you had and planting a bunch of weeds that are going to compete with the good 15,000 plants that you had. So corn, I know it's tempting to just, if you got a little area and you don't want to get the field cultivator out and it's a 2-acre hole and all you're doing is trying to suppress the water hemp, I don't care what you do. But, if it's a whole field or it's a big enough area that it ought to be done right, you need to remove the old stand. Some of these ponded areas, there won't be an old stand, and it may go from a perfect 35 to 0 in 5 feet. And if it does, well, that's easy. You just plant in the hole. I've replanted fields where I drove the whole field and I just dropped the planter where I needed to, and I picked it up where I didn't. And I drove the whole damn field because I didn't want to miss a spot. But sometimes, and this could be one of those years where it goes from a perfectly fine, leavable stand, you can't believe how good it is, to there's nothing there in 2 paces. And if that's the case, you don't need to work that. Just replant the holes. But if you end up in one of those crappy situations where you've got holes and then the edge of the hole gradually over 100 yards goes from nothing to a full stand, and you got acres and acres of half a stand on the edge of the holes, that's a field that it'd probably be easier just to tear the whole thing up and start over again, unfortunately. So a lot of judgment calls get made. You can do what you want to do. It's your farm. If you planted our seed, we're gonna stand behind you. You can have the seed. You can do whatever you want with it. I can't forbid you from doing something in a replant situation. We're going to make a recommendation to you, but it's your call. The only thing you can't do with our replant seed is stash it in your barn and not really replant it and save it for next year. Can't do that. But if you truly are replanting and you say, hey, I know you tell me I could leave 29,000. I don't want to live with 29,000. I want it to be 35,000. That's when I planted the first time. If you want to tear up 29,000, start over again, that's your call. You can do that. We've got plenty of seed for replanting, but I will warn you, in some cases, it will not be the same hybrid you planted the first time. So there will also perhaps be some judgment calls made of, well, okay, if I can't have what I want, do I live with this less than ideal stand of my favorite hybrid, or do I plant something else and go ahead and tear up my favorite hybrid? So we always hope we don't have to have those kind of conversations, but it seems like we always do. And if you're in some of the wetter areas, unfortunately, you may have the misfortune of being able to have them more than others. And I would say, in addition to population, other things I recommend when you're evaluating stands is, population would be the first thing to look at. After that, I would say the health of the seedlings that are there is important. So I've had situations where it's a pretty good looking plant above ground, but when you dig it up and look at the roots, if the roots are half dead or damaged or decaying, or if the radicle has died, that plant's probably going to be more like a weed than a good plant. So evaluate those plants for their health and their quality. And if you're finding half of the plants that you're counting as a good plant have health issues, probably shouldn't count those as good plants. And then the third thing to look at would be the uniformity of that stand. Do you have big skips and big gaps? If you've got 26,000 perfectly uniform, usually doesn't happen. And if there are skips and gaps, then there are penalties. You can assign the yield potential of that stand based on the size of those skips and gaps. So those are really the things that you want to take into account. If you're replanting before May 20th, we need to have a pretty good stand to justify leaving it. The later it gets, the more forgiving we're going to be with keeping that old stand, because we do start to lose yield potential on the replant stand. And the other thing I like to remind people is we tend to make this mistake. We assume the replant will be perfect. You can't guarantee that the replant will be perfect. I've seen situations where guys have replanted 2 or 3 times, and every time they plant, they get a big rain after they plant, and we're just kind of trapped in that vicious cycle. And unfortunately, we not too long ago, people were worried about soil recharge and soil moisture and lack of moisture and how dry it is. Well, we're pretty well recharged now, and half an inch is going to make a pond. So if we keep getting, moisture, it's gonna, we're gonna keep struggling with this in these poorly drained fields. And you guys, and I would be one of them, who farm poorly drained ground, you know who you are, and you know that the reality of the situation is, when we're in a wet spring type scenario, that poorly drained soil, it's just really difficult to get that stand that you wish you could have on it. And hopefully we can work through that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about planting depth. Planting depth is a fun thing to talk about. So there's so many directions you could go with this. We could talk about what is the optimum planting depth, and we can't really get wide agreement on that either. You all do what you do, and I've gotten lectured by farmers that pretty damn confident that they know that 1.25 inches is the best planting depth for corn. And I've been lectured by farmers who are pretty damn confident that 2.5 inches is the best planting depth for corn. My agronomic expertise tells me something around 2 inches is the best planting depth for corn. But what I tell people is, if you're less than 1.5 inches, it should be deeper. If you're more than 2 inches, that's probably deeper than it needs to be. If you're more than 2.5, that's a lot deeper than it needs to be. You need 3 things. You need to be at least 1.5 inches, in my opinion. You need to have good seed soil contact, and you need moisture. So if you're above 1.5 inches, got good seed soil contact, and your seed is in moisture, well done. Whether you think 1.75 inches is perfect, or 2 inches is perfect, or 2.25 is perfect, or 1.6 is perfect, or whatever you think perfect is, as long as your definition of perfect meets these parameters of more than 1.5 inches, good seed soil contact, and you've got seed and moisture, I'm happy with what you're doing. So I had an interesting question from a guy the other day. He wanted to know, should we pay attention to, when we're measuring seed depth, should we pay attention to, are we measuring to the top of the seed or the bottom of the seed? So if it's a big round, the difference between the top and the bottom might be over 1/4 inch. And this guy's being really particular on his planting depth. So I'd honestly never had that question before. There is no generally accepted standard practice of how to measure seed. Adam and I were joking about this earlier. So I'm going to draw a soil surface. I'm going to draw a seed furrow, and I'm going to draw a seed in the bottom of this seed furrow. We just talked about the fact that the ideal planting depth is somewhere between 1.5 inches and 2 inches deep. So if as long as you don't have seeds at 1.5 inches, 2 and 2.5 in the same field, don't want that. You want to be consistent in your depth, but somewhere between 1.5 inches and 2.5, depending on conditions, you're fine. So it doesn't really bother me too much which side of the 1/4 inch seed we're measuring to, because that 1/4 inch is kind of irrelevant in the big scheme of things. So I don't worry about that. I measure to the top myself, because as I'm digging and excavating, what's the first part you come to? The top. So as soon as I can see the seed coat, that's what I do. I measure to that. So I measure to the top. So let's say you've got a flat field, which is a good goal, by the way. When you get done planting your field, if it's tabletop flat, job well done. We'll talk about that in a minute. So on a flat field, it's pretty easy. You measure from the surface down to the top of the seed, and whatever that is, it is. What if we don't have a flat field? So what if you like to make some pretty soft, mellow stuff? And what if your planter's pretty heavy? And what if your field after planting kind of looks like that, where you got this trough here? And in some cases, this might be the difference between the top and the bottom of the trough might be 2 inches or more. And then here's your trench, and here's your seed. And then sometimes you got that little hump there in the middle between where your press wheels were. So if you want to overthink this, which some of you do you lay a ruler across the trough and measure from the imaginary point there down to the seed? Do you say, well, this is going to mellow down and going to end up somewhere like here, and so you measure from there down to the seed? Do you say, well, here's the surface of the soil above the seed, so any dummy knows that you measure from there down to the seed? And this can be debated constantly by different people of where to even start the measurement. So this seed is planted at the depth it's planted at. One guy might call that 2 inches. One guy might call it 3. One guy might call it 4, depending on how you measure that. And there's also no generally accepted practice of how to do this correctly either. We all have our own opinions on that. And then, if you want to go further, most of us don't even measure seeding depth with anything other than our knuckles. And I don't have a tape measure here. I got short, fat, stubby fingers. My second knuckle is honestly probably a short 2 inches. Adam's second knuckle, probably not much different than mine. But some of you guys are really lucky, and you're like 6'6", and you got these big hands and could palm a basketball. Your second knuckle might be 3 inches. So if the only thing you're using to measure your depth is your knuckle, hey, none of this matters, because you don't know how deep your seed is anyway. But you know what you know what you like, do what you do, and it usually works out just fine. So we're just having a little fun here this morning. All right, so let's talk about bugs. Lots of bug issues. How many of you raised some alfalfa? I'm raising some alfalfa, and alfalfa is going to get pretty hard to look at here. Some of it already is. Alfalfa weevil are horrible this year, and seemingly across a pretty widespread area. Why is that? Primarily the warm February and March. So from January 1, which is when you start counting heat unit accumulation, if you're a bug that's been out here in the environment as an egg, they're hatching out early. They're going to have an opportunity to do a lot more damage, and the populations seem to be fairly high. So if you're raising pure stands of alfalfa, be on guard. You may have already sprayed for weevils. If you haven't, and you haven't looked at your alfalfa, get out there and take a look at it. Mine is hopefully getting sprayed today. Should have been sprayed about Monday, probably. And if you're getting close to flowering on the alfalfa, best practice is probably just to take that first cutting early and harvest that, and then keep a close eye on the second cutting as it's regrowing. But if your first cutting alfalfa is less than a foot tall like mine is, has a lot of growth potential yet, I wasn't planning on cutting it for another probably 3 weeks. It needs to be protected from weevils. We're also seeing some pretty elevated trap catches in some counties on cutworm. And with the early development of cutworm, we're going to have cutworm active on some very small corn, and so that means they can just do more damage. They can cut more plants. Lots of things from a management perspective to think of. So Tricepta hybrids are pretty highly resistant to cutworm feeding, so they're not going to get much more than probably one of those before they get a bellyache and die. If you're using a insecticide in with your pre-emergence application for cutworm control and prevention, that's pretty effective. Rescue treatments are highly effective for cutworm. What makes rescue treatments less effective is we don't pull the trigger on them in time, or we're not scouting enough, or we don't catch it in time, and we lose too many plants before we make that application. But if you can make that timely rescue application, cutworm is a very it's one of the best examples of IPM in insects, because it's easy to scout for. The treatments are relatively inexpensive. The treatments are very effective, and you absolutely can save a field from cutworm feeding if you catch it in time and make that application of it's going to cost you more to drive across the field with the sprayer than the product is going to cost to control those cutworms. So good scout and spray if you have to type insect. Flea beetles are another insect that gets talked about a little bit. Flea beetles are one of the insects that actually does benefit from a mild winter, and we've had a very mild winter. Now flea beetles are, they're a problem just from the feeding. They're also a problem because they vector some viruses. Stewart's wilt would be a disease that is vectored by flea beetles. Most hybrids are highly enough resistant to Stewart's wilt. I wouldn't necessarily be freaked out about flea beetle feeding, but inbreds are different, and there are a lot of inbreds. So if you're involved in seed production, flea beetles is a little more concerning. If you're raising sweet corn, flea beetles are more concerning. So if you happen to be planting corn that happens to be susceptible to the virus that causes Stewart's wilt, then you might need to be more proactive on flea beetle control. The high rates of seed applied insecticides that most of us are planting offer pretty good control of flea beetles. They offer some control of cutworms, although not a lot. The traits that some of us are planting, anything with Viptera in it, has pretty good protection against cutworm feeding. Most of the other traits offer, at best, suppression, not really worth talking about. But if you've got our Tricepta seed trait package out there, or hybrids that include the Viptera trait, they will be pretty well protected from cutworm. You're going to get a little bit of cutting because they have to eat the plant to die, And by the time they've eaten enough plant to get sick and die, they may have cut one or two, depending on the size of the larvae and the size of the plant. So it is looking like it's going to be a little bit buggy this year, and whether that's the cool wet, whether that's the early warm up, whether that's the mild winter, you can blame it on whatever you want to blame it on, but we're still going to need to manage some of these insects in some cases. And cutworms love green fields, and sometimes if you're the only guy with a green field, the moths can kind of flock to your field. And if your neighbor's fields were tilled ground or had a fall burn down, they're not going to look very attractive to those cutworm moths. So another possible problem with not doing fall burn down, not doing tillage, letting your fields get really green with winter annuals is those are the fields that look the most attractive to insects. So we do tend to see more insect pressure in fields with heavy weed pressure. You can also have more insect pressure in cover crop fields, and that can be we don't like to highlight the downsides of cover crops, but those fields are green too, and those fields are more attractive to moths and other species of insects that are looking for a good place to lay eggs. So I would be more vigilant on those acres that were, for whatever reason, green or weedy.
Hey, Lance, just might mention real quick to any viewers, if you got any questions, we had a little connection glitch and had to start over, and things have been running great since we reconnected. But unfortunately, when we reconnected initially and we set up the new session, we didn't have the chat available because of the kids aspect of it. So it's fixed now. Jennifer got it taken care of for us, but you have to refresh. So if you do have a question, you need to refresh and come back. And then you can ask your question. So just in case anybody's out
thanks
there.
for highlighting. So that would be what happens when I set up the new stream instead of Jennifer setting up the new stream. It gets set up incorrectly. I was proud of myself for remembering how to do it. I just remembered how to do it incorrectly. So anyway, thank you, Jennifer, for fixing that. So thanks, Adam, for calling that out. I had not noticed that yet. So we do want your questions, and all you have to do is do a refresh on it. I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be here. When you come back in after the refresh, you should see the chat there and be able to ask us questions in the chat. So thanks for calling that out, Adam. I do want to say back on the insect issue for a while. So Kelly Estes, who is a really good resource here in the state of Illinois, she is the pest survey coordinator for the University of Illinois. She puts a lot. I'm not on Twitter, but she puts a lot of good stuff on Twitter. I was actually looking for some of her things last night online, and I couldn't find them where I was looking. Her stuff's on Twitter, but she is in charge of the monitoring that University of Illinois does for these different insects, and they put out a lot of good maps of what they've been catching in moth traps. They put out lots of forecast predictions on how much longer before feeding begins, how long will feeding continue. So with weevils, for example, as those larvae develop, they go through different instars, and based on how many heat units we've accumulated and based on the size of the larvae, you can predict how many more days they're going to be feeding. And that you might want to take that into account if you're thinking about cutting versus spraying versus doing nothing on your alfalfa weevil. So follow her on Twitter and look for her information online if you want a good resource. So another thing that's kind of an interesting development this year, I've had several people tell me that they're finding small emerged cotyledon size water hemp already in the last few days of April. And we don't typically expect to see emerged water hemp in April, but we typically have not accumulated the heat units that we've accumulated this year by the end of April. So heat unit accumulation before you plant, we typically ignore. But heat unit accumulation before you plant is developing insects and is developing weeds because they're already planted. They're already there. So those 80-degree days in February, well, they're growing. Those 80-degree days in March, they're growing. If you didn't plant any corn until April 5th, your heat unit accumulation starts from the day you plant your corn, but your weeds and your bugs development starts from basically January 1. So if you go back and look at January 1 heat unit accumulation, we're way ahead of normal. And, the crop may or may not be way ahead of normal based on when you plant. But the insects and weeds are way ahead of normal. So keep that in mind. If you're out there spraying burn downs and making early pre-emergent applications, you got to be aware of what's emerged post-emergence, because I don't care how little that water hemp is, you're not going to kill it with Roundup. You're going to need something else in that tank, either some dicamba or some 2,4-D, or maybe your residual product that you're using might have some activity to be able to take that down. So, weeds are small. The summer annual weeds that are emerged are small, and they're easy to kill now if you're using something that will kill them. But if you're out there kind of applying that not thinking about post, because you don't figure there's anything there other than maybe some winter annuals that you're not that concerned about, and Roundup's going to get those unless mare's tail is in that winter annual weed mess that you've got, and then we're going to miss that too. So there's probably lots of fields out there that, in addition to your traditional Roundup burn down, you're going to want some dicamba, some 2,4-D, something to help with some of those tough broadleaf species out there, and they're a little more developed than normal just because of the temperatures. So while we're on the herbicide subject, we'll talk about kind of 4 different scenarios that exist. So you might have emerged crop that has not been sprayed. You might have unplanted fields that have not been sprayed. You might have planted but not yet emerged fields that have not been sprayed, or everything in between. And so if you've got fields with emerged crop and you haven't gotten your pre on yet, you may have to make some changes of your intended program. So if your intended program was, I'm going to spray 15 gallon of UAN and Roundup and Trivol and maybe some atrazine, and you got V3 corn, you need a new plant, because you can't put that mix over V3 corn. If the corn's only V2 and you pull out the Roundup and you keep the UAN rate low enough, you might be able to get away with putting that on corn. If it's spike corn, that is a lot easier to, it's not going to absorb as much herbicide. You can get away with a lot of things if it's a true spike. As soon as that leaf starts to unfurl, and certainly as soon as that leaf starts to flop over, if you just think about that little spike sticking up, and when that herbicide droplet's raining down, most of those aren't going to fall on that spike. And so even though it's emerged, it's not very exposed to the product. As soon as it's got leaves out there hanging out going, hit me, it's going to get hit. And, there's a lot of products that are safe and can be applied post-emergence on corn, but you can't do it with UAN. You can't do it with crop oil. The reason you can't do it with Roundup in some cases, you know how much surfactant's in Roundup? There's almost as much surfactant in Roundup as there is glyphosate in Roundup. That is a very surfactantly heavy loaded formulation to make that glyphosate, as effective as possible. So there is a lot of, when you're putting 32 ounces of PowerMax 3 in a spray tank per acre, that is a heavy load of surfactant. And that's going to heat up everything else that's in that mix. When we get a little bit further into post-emergence applications, a lot of guys kind of experienced this the hard way last year. Let's say you've been using a herbicide for years. Let's say you like it with methylated seed oil, or let's say you like it with crop oil. Let's say you're using an AMS replacement product, and you're using the same stuff you've used for years, and you decide to throw a fungicide in on it because you heard that V5 fungicide is a good thing. Well, those fungicides are generally EC formulations. So there's emulsifiers and other things in that formulation, oil, emulsifiers, and it heats stuff up too. So every time you add something to a mix, it potentially changes the crop safety of the whole mix. The other thing that affects crop safety is, how many hot days have we had? How thick is the cuticle on that leaf? If it's been cool and moist like we've been, there's going to be virtually no waxy cuticle that has formed on the leaves of those corn plants. So it's going to just absorb everything you put on it. Now the weeds will too. So weeds should be very easy to kill right now, which is good. But crop is also going to be very easy to damage and burn. So just be aware that if you do the same thing you've always done, you might see more crop response. Or if you throw something new into the same thing you've always done, you're not doing the same thing you've always done because it's got something new in it. And so, just be careful. You start throwing, well, you guys say I need multiple modes of action. You guys say I need fungicide. I need this. I need surfactant. I need, you get all this stuff together, and there's a lot of, a lot of things working in that mix, and we can see some crop response. Now, a lot of times the crop response is visual only, but we've had experiences before. Some of you get pretty damn excited at visual only things. And we try, this Adam and I's job is to try to keep you from getting excited in negative ways. So just be aware of the things that we can see. So if you've got nitrogen left to go on your corn and you've got emerged corn, just be aware that there's a limit to how much nitrogen you can put on over the top. And depending on what herbicide you've got, make damn sure that herbicide is approved for post-emergence applications at the V stage that you're at, and make sure it's approved to do that in fertilizer, and make sure if you need to take the crop oil out, you need to take the surfactant out, or what you need to do to make that application safe. And at some point, if you can't get that application on, you really need to pull that nitrogen out, and you need to look at side dressing or spreading some urea or doing some other method of getting that nitrogen on rather than spraying it over the top, because it is just too hot. You're going to get too much crop injury, and it really exacerbates the injury that you see from different herbicides when you got 4 things in the tank at the same time. All 4 of them have the ability to injure corn, and 4 of them together are going to injure it a lot more than any one of them individually. So there's a definite additive effect there. So if your corn's not up yet and your field's a jungle, keep your Roundup rate up. Make sure that, because we've got mare's tail out there, we've got water hemp coming up out there, we got giant ragweed out there that's getting some size to them. There's weeds out there that Roundup would like some help on. And depending on whether it's corn or beans or what kind of beans is going to determine, what you can put in with that Roundup to provide that help. So if it's corn, something like Diflex or some sort of Safe and Dicamba is a great thing to add in there on that corn pre to make sure that you're getting good weed control of what's emerged. Before your corn comes up is the best time to kill every weed in your field. Because as soon as your corn comes up, then you're worried about damaging your corn while you're killing your weeds. If the corn's not up yet, you can kind of kill that weed, whatever way you want to. But as soon as corns emerge, then your options start to become limited. And unfortunately, with the wet soils and the rain and the delays and a lot of acres planted that maybe had not gotten sprayed yet, we could end up with a whole bunch of corn that somebody was planning on spraying after they planted, before it came up, but you're going to end up spraying it after it comes up. So just be aware that you might need to make some tweaks to your program if you're going to do that. So how about beans? What if you got beans planted with no herbicide applied? A lot of acres of that out there as well. If you did a fall burn down like Adam and I like, that field's still relatively clean. If you didn't do a fall burn down and you didn't do a spring burn down and you planted that field, your neighbors probably can't tell that field's been planted yet. I've had landlords ask me, when are you going to plant? Well, 3 weeks ago. So you can't see that stuff down through the mat that's there in some cases. So keep in mind, once soybeans start to emerge, all the really good water hemp stuff from a residual standpoint is off the table. So, no Valor, no Authority, no Sharpen, no Metribuzin if soybeans are emerging. So even if they're just starting to crack, is what it's called, most of those labels would say, you can apply after planting up to cracking. What cracking means is the soil's cracking open, that hypocotyl is pushing up through. There's no plant up yet, but anything that falls down in that crack is going to land on that hypocotyl And if you damage that as it's coming up through, that can be a problem. So just make sure that chemical cannot touch any plant tissue as it's emerging, and those products are all still good. But as soon as you've got plant tissue that's exposed, we're really down to basically a group 15, so like a Warrant, Outlook, Zidua type product. And you can still use foamosaphin, which is the active ingredient in the old Reflex product. So that's what Warrant Ultra is. Warrant Ultra is acetochlor with foamosaphin, and that is it's a PPO chemistry, but it's a PPO chemistry that can be applied pre or post. Now you may say, well, my water hemp are all resistant to post-emergence PPO chemistry, so why would I waste the money on post-emergence PPO? Well, yeah, for the weeds that are emerged, you need, if it's water hemp, you need some dicamba, or if it's an enlist acre, you need some 2,4-D in with that group 15, that PPO, and that Roundup to make sure that we control those emerged glyphosate resistant weeds. But for all the unemerged weeds that are going to be coming up later, that residual PPO, still has a big benefit. So when you're spraying, primarily pre, I really like having the ultra part of Warrant Ultra. If you're spraying later post, there really isn't much of a benefit to Warrant Ultra over Warrant, because if all your water hemp's already up, I would agree that foamosaphin is going to do nothing but burn your beans. It's going to burn your beans more than it burns your water hemp. And at that point, we need post-emergence control, not pre-emergent control. And then there wouldn't be as much of a benefit for that ultra part of Warrant Ultra. So, and then beans that, have been not planted and not sprayed, pretty easy to manage that. But just, again, remember, you might be doing burn down. You might be in burn down mode. Burn down mode, you're usually not worried about water hemp, but there's already water hemp emerged. So you've got to control not only the winter annuals. It's almost getting too late to control the winter annuals. Most of those have gone to seed already. And so at this point, it's kind of cosmetic weed control. We need to control those winter annuals either with a fall burn down or an earlier spring burn down, because by now they're about to die of old age. So if your control method for winter annuals is to let them die of old age after they've set a bunch of seed, that you're getting close to that point now. So while we're mentioning fall burn down, I would say still seeing huge benefits from fall burn downs. I've had a few people that are looking for things to complain about. Will say, well, my fall burn down's starting to break now. It feels not clean anymore. Well, yeah, I know, but look at it compared to the field that didn't get the fall burn down and tell me that's not a clean field. I would much rather be dealing with, the small summer annual weeds that are starting to come up. If you do a fall burn down, that does not mean you're not going to need a spring burn down, but it means you've got all sorts of options that can be your spring burn down. And it means if you're doing tillage, so I like to remind people all the time, fall burn down is not just for no-tillers. If you're wanting to work that soybean stubble field with a field cultivator before planting, you need a fall burn down too. How many of you have seen I call them muskrat huts, fields of work ground with these little mounds of knotted up, balled up chickweed scattered all over the place out there. You want to talk about a crappy seed bed to plant into. Sometimes the guys that want to do spring tillage I can plant through chickweed. I can't till through chickweed. So if I got a mess of chickweed, I'd rather be no-tilling into it than trying to work it. The soil finisher would maybe do a better job than a field cultivator is going to do. A vertical till tool will get through it, but that's not a good thing to pull into. If you're counting on your row cleaners to throw that mound of, it's like 50% soil and 50% wet knotted up chickweed. You need a pitchfork to move that, not a row cleaner. So I really see some advantages to fall burn down, even if tillage is your plan. And I will say this, I'm going to unsell my own product. If you do fall burn down for a couple years, or you do an early spring burn down for a couple years, your need to do it will diminish dramatically. Because if you just stop that stuff from going to seed a couple years, those seeds are, they don't live in the soil for 50 years like velvet leaf and giant ragweed. So if you stop that seed production cycle 1 year, the very next year, you'll see a dramatic reduction in the population of those weeds in your field. And these fields that are just solid, that's because we've never broke that cycle. Every year those weeds go to seed, and every year we produce next year's, crop out there of winter annual cover crop weeds. So cannot emphasize enough. And right now, everybody's motivation to do fall burn down this fall is really high. But what happens? Time passes. And as time passes, your motivation to do it, gets weaker and weaker and weaker. Fall gets here, you're trying to do anhydrous, you're trying to do fertilizer, you're, kicking yourself because your marketing wasn't as good as you wanted it to be. You're not sure you're going to make any money. It's like, I don't want to spend the money on that. Out of sight, out of mind. These fields look clean now. It was just the year. It won't be like that again next year. We don't need that. And you talk yourself out of doing that fall burn down. And a year from now, you're right where you're at now. Damn, I wish I'd done fall burn down. So don't lose your nerve. Don't lose your passion. Write it on the calendar. Make yourself a note. Write a letter to yourself. And put it away. And then October 1st, get that letter out and let it remind you of how committed you were to doing a fall burn down the 1st of May. And when it's the 1st of October, hammer down, follow through with that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about crown rot potential in corn. So all of the early planted corn that is up, good stands, good color, nice uniformity. I drove past some field. I went down into Adam's territory yesterday and picked up 4 bags of corn to help somebody out. He's got corn returns coming back in his territory already. So everybody else is going to be scavenging around in Adam's territory looking for stuff to plant. But, I drove past fields that if they're a well-drained field and they haven't been ruined savaged by water, I mean, you just look across those fields and they look nice. You don't have to look down the row for the stand to look nice. You can look across the rows and the stand looks nice. And that's always a good indicator for me that you've got a really good stand of corn when it's fairly small and you can look across the field and it looks nice and uniform, any way you look at it. So there's some really good stands of corn out there. And Chris Cowell likes to tease me. He thinks it about makes me vomit when I brag about how good, early planted corn looks, because I've gotten a reputation of being an early planted corn hater. And that's a little bit strong, a little bit unfair, in my opinion. But I do tend to think some people are irrational early corn lovers. That's not me. But I'd like, hater, lover, all depends on your perspective. So if you've got a lot of early planted corn that you're really proud of, what do we need to do to keep that early planted corn looking awesome all the way to black layer? So you might want to consider, if you've not been a V5 fungicide user, I would recommend considering that, because that can improve the health of those plants. And absolutely, without question, plan on putting a VT fungicide on that corn. The number one thing that we've seen to benefit the health of a corn plant, both through grain fill and at harvest, is the application of a VT fungicide. And that actually does, more than you would think to prevent crown rot by reducing the stress that the plant's going through grain fill. So you need to keep that plant healthy. You need to keep the stress level of that plant low. You need to hope that we don't go through a lot of heat and drought stress during grain fill. And so my 4 recommendations for managing crown rot in early planted corn is aggressive use of fungicide. And you can define aggressive however you want. Aggressive can be rate. Aggressive can be number of applications. Aggressive can be quality of product. Aggressive could be all of the above. So be aggressive, and you can define aggressive however you want. We need to have reduced stress during grain fill, which the only thing you can do to influence that is use fungicide. Mother Nature is more in charge of what the stress during grain fill is going to be than you are, but the aggressive use of fungicide will help. We need to control foliar diseases, which the aggressive use of fungicide is going to help. And the other thing you need to do, and this won't prevent it, this won't help it, but it will at least let you know what you're dealing with. During the dent stage, you need to be out in your fields, pinching stalks, splitting stalks, looking at how healthy is that crown, and at least getting some early indication of which fields are going to die early, which parts of fields are going to die early, which fields can you already tell even before black layer this field needs to be prioritized for an early harvest. The damage is done at that point. The yield loss is going to occur. You can't stop that. But those fields are going to yield way better harvested at 25% than they are harvested at 17% when they're starting to fall apart. So those are my 4 recommendations to manage crown rot on those early planted acres, which I fear have been set up. If things go right or wrong, however you want to look at it, the rest of the growing season, I think the potential is there to see a lot of crown rot again in the same part of the state that we saw a lot of crown rot in a year ago, depending on how grain fill goes based on, how that crop went in the ground and what it's been through since it's been in the ground.
I'd say one other little thing to add to the crown rot, trying to mitigate crown rot. It's not going to stop it, but help. And we talked about earlier today was, obviously drainage is great, natural drainage. You got good slope and all that in your field, and obviously tiling is awesome. Not everybody can afford that to do that all the time when they want to, but little things like ditching, getting the water, standing water off your field, anything you can do to try and help that is, it's going to help. I don't say it's going to prevent it, but it's going to help.
Right. And, and Adam makes a good point. And one, caveat I will add to that is I've had guys that have experienced issues where, they think a field had to be ponded to have a problem. You can have completely saturated soil without a pond, but if you've got a pond, you're going to have completely saturated soil longer. So if you can get rid of the pond, you're not eliminating the saturation. The saturation is still occurring. And if 2 days of saturation is enough to create a problem, you might not have helped yourself. But if 2 days of saturation doesn't create a problem and 4 days of saturation would have, well, then you just solved your problem. And I do have to give a shout out to, I was in that golden area yesterday. The amount of ditching that's done after planting in that area is kind of impressive. And it is, if you don't farm the kind of ground that needs to be ditched, it's probably, it's a little bit hard to imagine this, but knowing where those ditches need to be and the path that they need to take through the field. And, there's a lot of science there. I mean, with technology these days, you can map that out with GPS and, hell, your tractor could do it for you the next year. But if you're still doing it old school or the first time that you're mapping it out, you just need to know where it needs to go. And those guys have got a lot of experience with those fields. They know exactly where that ditch needs to be. They know where they need to outlet the ditch. They know they need to put a big old bow in it over here to get to that spot over there. And it was pretty impressive to me because that area got a lot of rain. And you could tell every ditch had been running water. Some of the ditches were still full of water. And at least then the ditch was a place for the water to kind of collect rather than being spread out all over the place. But a lot of work to make those ditches, but big benefit. And there's going to be a lot less replant in that part of the world because of those ditches. If those fields would have been just tabletop flat and no place for the water to go, there'd still be water standing in some of those areas. And someday those ponds would be getting replanted. But now, combination of early planting stuff was already up, plus the ditching helped. So good job, guys. So let's finish here on post-emergence weed control. So we're not done planting. We haven't got our pre's on in some cases. We're talking about, we need to think about post-emergence weed control as we're doing our pre, because we got a lot of weed species that are up already. But, on these early planted acres, they're ready to be posted. in some cases. If you've got a post-emergence program that you like to put on V2, V3 corn, well, you're there. If you're doing row and go on soybeans, you're there. So it's post-emergent season is here, even though it's only May 2nd, and don't hold back. We get made fun of a lot with our lovely dicamba label and that June 12th cutoff date. Well, if your beans are ready to be posted on May 2nd, why do you care about a June 12th cutoff date? You should be long done before June 12th gets here. So don't hold back. Go early. There are a lot more mistakes made spraying post too late than there are spraying post too early. Whether you're using Liberty, whether you're using Roundup and dicamba, whether you're using Roundup and 2,4-D, whether you're using, whether you're non-GMO, I don't care what you are, spray early post. So post-emergent season is upon us. So we talked about crop safety concerns with the tank mixtures and adjuvants and the crop being really succulent and really easy to damage. So that was point number one. We've already talked about that. We've already talked about multiple mode of actions for water hemp. So make sure whatever you're spraying has at least two, active modes of action for water hemp. So if you've been relying on dicamba post-emergence in corn for water hemp, or if you've been relying on an HPPD, more and more guys are realizing, well, I need to rely on both of those things together because straight dicamba might miss some. Straight HPPD is missing a lot in some cases due to HPPD resistance. But the combination of HPPD with dicamba don't miss much. So that's probably the strongest program you can do. A good pre with multiple modes of action to hopefully control 85% of your water hemp. Now 15% of your water hemp is a lot of water hemp. So the post-emergence products are still important, but hopefully your good pre is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and we just need to take the stragglers out with that post trip. Consider additional residuals. So that is one reality of if you're going to spray earlier, that means you're spraying more bare ground. That means you're spraying fields that are going to be further away from canopy. And you can add, a product like Warrant to corn and soybean post-emergence mixes. And it's more common in soybeans than it is in corn. But sometimes some additional residual is warranted, no pun intended, on all crops. And Warrant is a very nice, very safe, very easy to use, doesn't create a lot of burn. It's a water-based formulation. That's one product you can throw in with a lot of different mixes, and it's not going to heat that mix up. So if you want to spray corn early when it's small and not have to spray it again, maybe strengthening up that residual that's out there, not a bad idea. If you've got, dicamba has some residual, but it's not a very long-lived residual. And if you've got HPPD resistant water hemp in your field, not only is an HPPD not going to kill the emerged water hemp, it's not going to be very effective at preventing the emergence of more water hemp either if they're resistant to that chemistry. So lots of potential benefits to adding additional residual in your post-emergence pass. So that's something to think about if you're looking to raise the bar on your weed control. Remember on dicamba this year, we're operating under the existing stocks use order, which that doesn't change the label, but it does change the movement and sale of the product. So if you're planning on, if you're a retailer and you're going to be applying dicamba, or if you're a farmer and you're going to be applying dicamba, the dicamba has to be in the possession of the person who's going to apply it no later than May 12th. So May 12th is the last day that a distributor can take product that's setting in Des Moines, Iowa, and ship it to a dealer or a farmer in Macomb, Illinois, let's say. Now you have until June 12th, plus the other label restrictions, to apply the product. But transport of the product from retail or from distribution to a different retailer or to a grower has to be completed by May 12th. So you need to get that product in place over the next 10 days and have it with your applicator, where who's going to be doing the applying. And then hopefully long before June 12th, we've got all of our dicamba applied. So just to call that out. And then the last thing I would recommend, and this is something I've been harping on for a couple of years, I'm going to continue to harp on this. We used to scout a lot before we sprayed because you needed to know what to put in the tank. You need to know what rate of Roundup. You need to know what rate of this, what rate of that. These days with the programs we're doing, like with dicamba, there's one rate. You don't change the rate of dicamba. We usually run pretty similar rate of Roundup. We don't tend to tweak stuff as much before application. So I would argue you don't have time to scout your fields every week. I get that. The time I would like to scout is actually 7 to 10 days after your post application. That is the best time to determine what I miss. If you walk out in the field 10 days after you spray it with, whatever your post program is, and you got weeds out there that are clearly healthy, well, you already know you need to be back in that field making another application. If you've got weeds that are sick but not dead, maybe they're going to go ahead and die, but you know that you need to keep a close eye on that field. If you walk out in that field and it is nuclear clean 10 days after you sprayed it, then you know that the only way that field gets weedy late is if you get a late flush of weeds. Late flushes of weeds do not happen as often as you all think they do. What we see are weeds that we didn't kill the first time that we don't know they're there until they're 3 feet tall in August. That's not a late emerging weed. A late emerging weed is not going to grow up through a dense, lush soybean canopy and be a 3 foot tall weed in August. That's a weed that either came up the day after we sprayed and our residual missed it, or we sprayed it, but we didn't kill it. That's most of the weeds that we deal with for the rest of the summer. And that weed in either of those scenarios is going to be there 10 days after you spray. And he's going to be little and he might be sick, but he's there. And that's the time to do something about that weed. Not when you notice him in August when he's taller than your beans, because by that time, everything is off label, nothing is effective, and we're going to be losing yield in those soybeans with anything that we do. So if you're going to scout your fields, which I very much recommend, I would scout them 7 to 10 days after you make that post trip. You can make a pretty good call at that point. Am I going to need another post trip in this field or am I not? And if there are weeds there 10 days after you sprayed your first post trip, guarantee you, you're going to need to be back in that field. Now, even if there's not, you may still want to make a follow-up application later. But if there are weeds there already 7 to 10 days after you sprayed your post pass, I guarantee you that field's going to get sprayed again. And you'd be a lot better off to get it done in May or early June than not realize you need to do it until July or August. So with that, I think we're already a little bit over time. So anyway, we're kind of an AT and a half here today with the shaky start and discontinuing and starting back up again. So we'll be back with you in 2 weeks, which would be the 16th. I'm guessing.
Yep.
Easy math on that for me. 14 plus 2. So May 16th, we'll be back with you. Hopefully Adam has time to join us again. Appreciate Adam coming up. It's been a long time since I've done an Ask the Agronomist with Adam. It's nice to have my dual agronomist here for ATA, and appreciate him coming up. And sorry for the technical glitches we had. Hopefully you bore through that. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. Everybody stay safe. Hopefully we make a lot of planting progress in that 2 week window, but we'll see what Mother Nature does. So everybody take care.